Hi everybody, thanks for coming. I'm Joe Cosentino and I chair a wonderful resident interest group here, LGBTQIA+ and Allies of Woodland Pond. And since it's June Pride Month, we have an amazing array of activities this month. This is the first, so we're excited about this, but look into Woodland Life or near the mailroom. We have a list, Chanticleer, of everything that's coming. Besides this week, on Thursday at 2, Fred and I are going to be interviewed here for Council Connections. And then at 7:15, we have Key of Q, musical group, 20 a cappella singers singing amazing songs by Lady Gaga, Elton John, Cyndi Lauper. It's costing Woodland Pond, so we want people to come. Unlike you, I should have said that in front of you.
That's okay, but now I know that we can charge you back when they rehearse in the okay.
Richard is nice enough to do this, but Key of Q is a professional group and they're going to charge us. So please tell your friends, tell everybody. And then we have movies coming, we have a happy hour, we have a panel of allies from our group. We have lots and lots of things going on. Oh, also Dawn Sangri's going to show her movie about the first same-sex marriages in New Paltz. And she's a resident here. She was arrested before it was legal for same-sex marriage. And she's good. So we have a lot of really exciting things. And we can rest in July. Let other groups take over. So you know the rap, if anything, if the emergency alarm goes off, everyone just screams, "Jason, help me." we stay in place and wait for instructions. So Richard has been here before.
Yes,
Richard Heil Diortiz has been here before. He's the executive director of the LGBTQ+ community center in Kingston of the Hudson Valley. And he's going to talk to us today about LGBT rights. Obviously, if anybody's looked at the news, we get horrified every day. So a lot of us are concerned. And so thank you very, very much for coming.
Thank you, Joe. And thank you to all of you. Happy to be here. I am a New Paltz native, so I knew New Paltz before there was a Woodland Pond. And it's always nice to come here, and Woodland Pond has been such an incredible addition to our community. Joe mentioned what I do for a living, that I'm the executive director of the Hudson Valley LGBTQ+ Community Center. I've also done a couple of other things that kind of relate to what we're gonna talk about tonight. I am the founding executive director of Philadelphia's LGBT Community Center, which is called the William Way LGBT Community Center. And prior to that, I worked for the ACLU. At a time when some of the legislation, some of the thought behind legislation that has given our community and individuals in our community more rights, that was evolving. And
speak louder.
Okay, speak even louder. Okay, thank you. If I do that again, you can just yell out. I have a staff person who says whenever I call them the wrong name, which I do occasionally, they call me Dick. So you can just say Dick and then I'll know. What we're going to discuss tonight, we're going to talk about formal and informal legal rights. And you see I put rights in quotes of queer and trans individuals from the 19th century forward. So I'm going to touch a little bit in the 19th century and kind of bring us forward. We're going to talk about the progress that was made or has been made in the 20th century and the current century, or in the 21st century as well. And then we're going to talk about historical challenges and rollbacks to the legal and informal status of queer and trans individuals. Because just like other civil rights issues in our country, it's not necessarily kind of this clear arc. It kind of, things have gotten better, then they've gotten worse, then they've gotten better, then they've gotten worse. And anyone want to guess where we are in that right now?
Worse.
Yes, we're We don't know if we're all the way down there, I hope, but we are on a bit of a downward trajectory right now. I think it was Martin Luther King Jr., Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. who said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And that's kind of exactly what we're talking about here. We're also going to talk about some key victories in more recent history, and where we stand today, how we're protected, and what threats exist. So I think these are all good things to know to give us perspective, but also to understand where we are now. Okay. I just want to mention also, if I'm not talking loud enough, as we said, let me know. And if you have a question, please don't hesitate to interrupt me. Totally fine to do that. So I thought we'd start out with this photo, taking us to the 19th century. This photo kind of is symbolic of something that occurred that was custom in some ways, or was not as unusual as one might think in the 19th century. Anyone have any idea what this is called, what we're seeing here? Well, there was a particular term for this, for women who made a choice to live together as a couple. And when we're talking about as a couple, one of the things that's important to recognize is that how people have defined themselves, how queer and trans people have defined themselves, has changed over time. I'm 58, and when I came out, there was G and there was L, and that was it. And then there was B, and today we have T, we have IA. There are different ways that people identify themselves. So when we look at this couple here, they probably would not have defined themselves as gay. They probably would not have defined themselves as lesbian. But this was an arrangement called a Boston marriage. And it was not uncommon in the 19th century among a certain social strata of women. So this was middle and upper middle income women, generally who had resources, training, education that allowed them to be self-supporting, because this was occurring in the 19th century, and I'm talking post-Civil War into the early 20th century, at a time when the ability of women to support themselves was limited by society, what women could or were allowed to do. But Boston marriages were not that uncommon. They were long-term committed relationships between two women who lived together, often independent of men. When we look at vintage photos like this, we can draw conclusions about them. We can look at them through our lens, but what we do know is there were many women who lived in this type of arrangement, and there were some that were famous or that were well known. And in fact, Henry James actually wrote a book about this novel, but about this type of relationship that existed. So this is in a time when there were no legal rights that specifically defined rights for what we today would call LGBTQ individuals. But these were women who were making a choice to live together, and to do that in certain communities at certain times, to do that with a certain level of acceptance, if not acceptance, just acknowledgement. Not a couple who would necessarily, in their social strata, in their neighborhood, in their environment, be subject to harassment. And this was not something that existed with just women. Anyone have any idea who the person on the left is here? Did I hear someone say Walt Whitman? Okay, yes, that is Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman, of course, is famous. There's a bridge outside of Philadelphia named for him. There are other things, of course, as well. But Walt Whitman was someone who had relationships with other men. And this is one of the men that he had a long-term relationship with. I believe James Dooley was his name. And Walt Whitman was not secretive about this. This was part of his persona. He was relatively well known. He was an extraordinary self-promoter, in addition to being a writer and a poet and other things. He was a very good self-promoter, and that's one of the reasons he became famous. And he never hid the fact that his chosen companions were men. And so he was able to live relatively openly. But can anyone see the commonality between what I just described as Boston marriages and perhaps Walt Whitman? Well, these were individuals who lived at a certain strata. These were not necessarily working class individuals. These were individuals who had the means to support themselves and could move in circles that were more accepting, or at least did not impose impediments. And this was not perfect at all, but this was, again, not as uncommon as we might think. And there are some who think as well, I, through my mother's family, am descended from James Buchanan, our 15th president. And probably up until 47, our worst president. But James Buchanan was someone who was rumored to be gay as well. Didn't use that term, but never married, had a close relationship with a senator from the South. Some of their correspondence still exists. One side of it exists because James Buchanan's sisters and his niece destroyed all of the correspondence that he received from the senator. But in Washington, before Buchanan became president, the two of them lived together. So even going back to pre-Civil War, there were some examples of this. But again, a certain strata of individuals who could live in this way. And then we move forward a little bit. Anyone have any idea what era or what time period we're talking about looking at these women? 1920s, exactly. So 1920s and the Harlem Renaissance. And we often think of the Harlem Renaissance as a time when the African American community was in some ways able to come into its own and really be more open, more expressive. And there is, throughout our history, there is a relationship between the progress forward in the LGBTQ plus community and in the African American community. And I'll talk about another way that occurred in the 1960s. But as the Harlem Renaissance was happening, not only did it give greater freedom to African Americans, it gave greater freedom to gay men and to gay women, because this was a time of greater openness and acceptance. Now this was limited, of course, because this was happening in Harlem, and I don't know that one could even, on the island of Manhattan at the time, find the same level of acceptance if, for, let's say, for example, you know, this was a trio, or you had a same-sex couple who were down on Orchard Street on the Lower East Side. But in Harlem at this time, given the environment there, not only was there greater openness and acceptance of African Americans kind of being who they were and living a full social life out in public, this extended to gay men and women as well. But still, we're at a time when all of these rights, this ability to live openly to some extent, to be accepted to some extent, or to at least be acknowledged, were all informal. Nothing was codified in law. So this places, even though this was a time when LGBTQ individuals were able to be more open, it was also a time that was where they were vulnerable because there were no legal protections. Really what this time was about was a greater level of acceptance and openness. And what we learn as we move forward in time is that acceptance can easily be rolled back or taken away. And that happened very soon after this, because in our history, you know, we had the 1920s where it probably would have been in some ways a fascinating time to live because of kind of the joyousness and the frivolity that was going on in our country in many ways, but we all know that we had a reckoning at the end of the 1920s. And the reckoning brought about a period that that ultimately rolled back some of that acceptance, that little bit of acceptance that gay men and women had been able to achieve. And really, you know, our country had other things we were focused on in the Depression, of course, and then World War II came upon us. And World War II created some dramatic shifts in demographics and in expectations of men and women. This was a time where men were compelled to go to war. So the idea of being kind of, free and gay and just being frivolous, this was not a time for that. So there was a different expectation placed on men at this time. There was also a different expectation placed on women. So men were pushed into military service, and as that happened, there was concern about homosexuality, which is, we didn't use the term gay then, it was homosexuality. There was concern about it because of the potential impact that it could have on our armed forces. This is something, unfortunately, we still hear today, as both women and LGBTQ individuals, particularly trans individuals, are being erased or removed from our armed services. So this is a narrative that goes back, 80 years. So things are changing in that way. For women, they were also changing because they were not compelled, but circumstances kind of allowed for or moved women into what were typically more male or masculine work. So it was an opportunity for women to have a different experience, more options than going back to the era of Boston marriages, where women had more options. So women could have greater flexibility in some ways. And I've got a photo here of Helen Grace James, because Helen was someone who served in the armed forces during World War II. And then, like many individuals, many women, she went into the workforce in a not unrelated field in the 1950s. She was from Long Island. And the reason I've got her photographed here is because she actually was caught up in what followed the war, because there was an abrupt shift at the end of the war. The dogma of the time was that men came home and they were expected to resume their jobs. But who was filling those jobs while they were at war? It was women. And so women were compelled to, or strongly encouraged, or forced to return back into the home and be homemakers. So this was really a shift from a period of greater openness and more options to more conformity. And that conformity had an impact on gay men and on women at the time. And so Helen was caught up in that. She was caught up in what was called the Lavender Scare. I assume that many of you have heard of McCarthy, right? And what he did in terms of trying to ferret out individuals he thought to be communists in the 1950s. The Lavender Scare was part of that. Ironically, J. Edgar Hoover, who was behind a lot of that, was a gay man who liked drag. So we'd love to get inside that head and try to figure out what was going on with that. The Lavender Scare really, it was a process of trying to find individuals who are homosexual, root them out, and persecute them for that. And some of you, there was a recent short series called Fellow Travelers, which was based on a book about this time period, about two men and their long-term relationship, which begins in the 1950s and goes all the way up through the 1980s and the AIDS crisis. So Helen Grace James, so she gets caught up in this. And it happens in a rather innocuous way. One day she was eating lunch in her car. She was at work, eating lunch, she had taken a break, was eating lunch in her car, and she was eating lunch in her car with another woman. She was, speak up? Okay. She was eating lunch in her car at her workplace with another woman. She was arrested for that. This happened on Long Island. This didn't happen in some faraway, more conservative place. It happened on Long Island, right here in New York. She was working for a company, Lockheed Martin, I believe it was, which was a military contractor. So she had taken the expertise that she had learned while she was serving the armed forces and then transitioned that into work in which she was supporting herself. She was arrested simply for being in a car with another woman at her place of work. And she lost her job. She ultimately did get an apology from the US government. Anyone want to guess how long that took?
Swine.
Keep going. very close. It took over 30 years. It was during the Obama administration that she got an apology. I'm sorry, during the Clinton administration, rather, that she got an apology for what our government had done to her, simply because she was suspected of being a lesbian and she was caught eating lunch in her car with another woman. This is an example of what happened during the Lavender Scare. And there were certain professions that were targeted. Women were targeted, men were targeted, men in teaching professions were targeted. It was really a time where the little bit of acknowledgement and acceptance that had occurred in the 1920s really shrank back. And so this is where that arc kind of jumped backwards. And executive order. How many now cringe when they hear those words? Right? Executive orders are not a new thing. This president tends to use them more because I think for him they're kind of like royal proclamations. But executive orders have been used by presidents throughout time. And one particular executive order, which was issued in 1953, it formalized or made a goal of the executive branch to ferret out individuals. So as a result of that executive order in 1953, 10,000 queer individuals, and I use different terminology here because, like I said, we call ourselves things differently than people would have then, but 10,000 queer individuals were removed from government service or were blacklisted. So they could have been working in private professions or for companies that were not military contractors, but they were blacklisted all the same. So communists and LGBTQ individuals, or suspected communists and LGBTQ individuals, were all kind of grouped together and treated this way. So this is post-World War II, and guess what the Nazis did? They did very much the same thing. They lumped gay individuals and suspected communists together and persecuted them. So we just fought the war, we're victorious over the Nazi regime, and in some ways we were replicating that here. And what's important about this time is that this was all occurring at a time when there was still no legal rights defined in statute or by courts. So LGBTQ individuals had no recourse. And even organizations like the ACLU, which have taken up unpopular causes throughout their history, founded in the 1920s, even they did not take up this cause. They certainly did represent suspected communists who were blacklisted, but not queer individuals who were blacklisted, probably because of underlying bias that existed even among very liberal people at the time. So I mentioned that there was no protection, no legal protection at the time that this was occurring. However, I want to jump back for a sec. This period and what happened to people like Helen Grace James did bring about the kind of the beginnings of activism. Two organizations were founded in the later 1950s, moving into the 1960s, and they were important because it was the first time that gay individuals, lesbian individuals came together and said, we are going to organize in some way to fight for our rights. And that was the Mattachine Society and the Daughters of Bilitis. And these two organizations, they came together independently at about the same time period. The Mattachine Society had a chapter in San Francisco and one in New York. The Daughters of Bilitis was primarily based here, but had chapters in other parts of the country as well. And it was the first time in our history where individuals, queer individuals, came together to organize and to support one another formally. They still operated very much undercover in a way, and tried not initially to draw attention to themselves, and that created friction down the road, but it was as a result of the Lavender Scare and kind of this retraction of just flexibility or openness that gay people had experienced before this. So one of the things that's important when we think about rights for LGBTQ plus individuals is the 14th Amendment. And the 14th Amendment is important in some other ways. Recently we had a decision called the Dobbs decision. Are anyone familiar with the Dobbs decision? It was the decision that undid Roe v. Wade. And there is a connection here because the Roe v. Wade, the decision there was connected to the 14th Amendment, specifically a right to privacy, which is not actually named in the 14th Amendment, but the court at the time drew from the 14th Amendment to make the decision they did in Roe v. Wade, and then this more recent court used a similar, used the 14th Amendment as a way to undo or reverse Roe v. Wade. But what this says, as some things that are important, is that no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, meaning that people can't or shouldn't be just swept up like they were in the Lavender Scare. If they had done something illegal, and there were certainly laws in the books about sodomy, for instance, at the time, they could be prosecuted, but they had the right to go through the process of being accused of a crime and defending themselves. And this last one, nor deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. This is important because this underpins some of the later decisions that occurred, because what happens over time, and we're seeing it happen now in the wake of the Dobbs decision, is that any individuals within the United States are not being afforded equal rights. Because if you live in Alabama and you're a woman who, you don't have the same options in terms of your reproductive health that a woman in the state of New York has. So there is not equal protection. The 14th Amendment is fundamental to a lot of the rights that we have. Some of you may have heard Chris McDaniel-Michio present. She does for Lifetime Learning Institute. She talks a lot about how fundamental the 14th Amendment is and how we don't understand just how fundamental it is to our rights as LGBTQ individuals and the rights that all of us, but particularly women in this moment, have. And just to give you an idea of some of the decisions that have been based on the 14th Amendment, Plessy versus Ferguson was one of them. Now that's been reversed, of course, but it was an important key decision that had its roots in the 14th Amendment and the interpretation of the 14th Amendment. Loving versus Virginia. You know, another case that when I talk about how the progress or the activism of the African American community in some ways been paralleled, or we have followed that as LGBTQ individuals, this is a really compelling example of that, because 1967, that overturned a Virginia law and laws in other states that made illegal marrying someone of another race. Now, this is, you know, two people of not the same gender, of opposite gender, but made marriage between individuals of the opposite gender who are of different races illegal. And Loving versus Virginia overturned that. And then we go to 2015, where same-sex marriage is approved, and that draws on the 1967 decision, because that decision basically said, you cannot prevent the marriage of individuals of the same sex or the same gender simply because they are of the same sex or same gender, and look back at Loving versus Virginia. These cases are all based, and Brown versus Board of Education is another one, an important one. Now what we're seeing unfortunately right now is the 2015 decision is definitely under attack. And there are individuals and organizations who are making it part of our mission their mission at this moment, and taking advantage of where we are politically to look at how to possibly overturn that law. But these are all decisions that are based on the 14th Amendment. So when you're dealing with someone who is an originalist, and you know, they think, well, it's not in the Constitution, one of the reasons that this is important is this is number 14 of the amendments that have modified or added to our Constitution, and it's so important. It's more important in some ways than the original parts, components of our Constitution. Okay, and some, in terms of our community, in terms of LGBT community, some decisions that were important to us, or that kind of moved our activism forward. One was 1958. This is the first time where an explicitly same-sex issue comes before the Supreme Court. This involved the magazine of the Mattachine Society, which I had mentioned. This is a magazine that they mailed out in plain brown wrappers to individuals who were members. And a case was brought against one magazine, actually in the state of California, brought against one magazine and the Mattachine Society for distributing this. And the basis for this was an 1873 law that still exists today called the Comstock Act, which forbids the distribution of obscene material via the U.S. mail. So, anyone want to define for me what obscene material is? It's very subjective, and it can be used that way. And there's been talk of using this again now in the reproductive rights arena. So, many of you know, women, even those who are living in states where access to abortion is not allowed under the law now, they have been able to access that when they need it through prescription, through a medical prescription abortion, through 2 different medications, which are distributed to them or sent to them via U.S. mail. And there's a case right here in New Paltz, a doctor right here in New Paltz, who Texas wants to arrest, although our county clerk said, no, I am not going to receive the request for extradition that was sent here to our county. And what he based that on was a state law that provides a shield that says we will not extradite individuals to states where the state is attempting to prosecute them for following laws that are legal in our state. So, but the fundamental basis of that, what Texas is trying to do right now, is that 1873 law, where they're saying this woman, this doctor here in New Paltz, through telehealth, wrote a prescription and medication was sent to this woman in Texas, and they are saying that was obscene. So it's a law that is still very much active or in discussion now. The outcome of the 1958 case, which was important and which did not just benefit our community, was that that you can't arbitrarily declare a publication obscene. So just because you do not like the content of a publication, which the postmaster in Los Angeles did not like the content of one magazine, he could not arbitrarily declare that obscene and therefore in violation of the Comstock Act. Small victory, but a victory nonetheless. And then in 1967, another case that kind of moved our rights forward was a case that very few people knew about. And honestly, before I worked for the ACLU, I never knew about this case. This case was regarding an individual who was born in Canada, and again, he became a resident of New York State. So, Canada, and as many families do, they kind of go back and forth across the border. He moved with his parents here as an adult. He became a permanent resident of New York State, and he was arrested for sodomy. And as a result, our federal government wanted to deport him. And that was, the deportation was actually allowed in that case because here in New York State, there was a law barring sodomy. And sodomy, part of the definition of sodomy was sex with an individual of the same gender or sex. And then 1986, this is a case, Bowers versus Hardwick. It was based in Georgia, where the police actually burst into the apartment of, I forget if it was Bowers or Hardwick, while they were having an intimate moment and arrested them. This was so individuals in their private space. And what the court ruled is that there is a right to privacy that is part of the due process clause of the 14th Amendment. So it's that right to privacy that connects to the Roe v. Wade decision. So you can see if our court could, using the right to privacy, if the right to privacy was a fundamental part of the Roe v. Wade decision, and this court could reverse that. You could see how they could use a similar rationale to reverse decisions like Bowers versus Hardwick, where they could say, well, there is nothing in the Constitution that gives us the right to privacy explicitly. And Clarence Thomas, in the Dobbs decision, actually put forward in his brief, or his, I forget what it's called, but his decision, he wrote a decision that concurred with the court's decision. Judges don't always do that. In this case, he did. And he said that the court should revisit decisions such as the decision regarding the legality of same-sex marriage, using this rationale that there is no fundamental right to privacy under the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. And then some other cases. Lawrence v. Kansas was another one. This is one that overturned. So we have the Bowers decision in 1986, which was found to be not in favor of the police or the state in arresting those two individuals. But in 2003, a Kansas case actually reversed that, where the court then said it was legal for two people in the privacy of their own home to have sexual relations. And then 2013 was another important case, again a New York case. So New York has been at the center of a lot of progress in terms of LGBTQ rights. And actually, I knew the name plaintiff in this case, Edie Windsor. She was a neighbor of mine out on the east end of Long Island many years ago. And she and her partner, Thea, met, and I forget when they met, but they were together for several decades. And Thea unfortunately developed multiple sclerosis, and she died leaving Edie. They had an apartment in the city, and then they owned this small, very modest house out in Southampton, leaving Edie with a very large tax bill. And it was a tax bill that she would not have had if she was legally married to Thea. And so the case involved that. The fundamental underneath it is, why should Thea, as a long-term partner of someone who happened to be the same gender, be subject to estate taxes that she wouldn't have been if she and Thea were of the opposite gender and had been married? And it was a case that was ultimately decided in Edie's favor. So it was another step in moving us forward. And then just 2 years later, we had the decision, I can never say this man's name right, Oberville, decision in that case which allowed or made legal same-sex marriage in all states. Before that, it was increasingly a patchwork of states. And I can tell you that my experience with that case, I had a personal experience with that case, during the period where other states had legalized, other states in Canada had legalized same-sex marriage, but New York had not yet legalized it. And at the time, our governor was Governor Patterson, who was filling in a term when Eliot Spitzer kind of imploded, and David Patterson took over as governor, and he issued an executive order that said our state had to recognize marriages performed legally in other states. And so my husband became a public school teacher. I, as a result, had access to the very good insurance that state employees get, which frankly everyone should have. But in order to get access to that, we had to go to another state where same-sex marriage was legal, get married, and show our state that marriage license. So there's the Yiddish term, eats my kishkas. At the time, it ate my kishkas to have to go to another state and get married so I could get a benefit that any one of Anthony's co-workers' spouses could have gotten. Because at the time, and this was just prior to 2015, same-sex marriage was not legal here. So this case involved two partners, two men. Again, one of them gets sick and predeceases the other. And all they wanted here was they wanted to ensure that Jim, much easier to say Jim than the last name for me, that Jim would be listed as a surviving spouse on his late partner's death certificate. That was it. That's really a simple thing. That's what he wanted. And there were reasons for that, because he needed to prove through legal documentation the nature of their relationship. But really that's all he was asking for. And it took over 3 years for the court, almost 3 years rather, for the court to issue a decision. But they did ultimately issue a decision. It came in June during Gay Pride Month or LGBTQ Pride Month, which was important. And this is where we get same-sex marriage being legal across the country instead of just in individual states. And as I said, there are people right now who are working kind of under the radar, but you know, if you go into the dark corners of YouTube or social media, you will find them, organizations that are working to try to figure out how to get the court to reverse this. And as I said, Clarence Thomas already opened the door to that by basically inviting those lawsuits to come to the Supreme Court. So, sorry. There we go. So where do we stand now? Because we're in a moment that where we have been going on a trajectory that has led to greater rights for all individuals, including LGBTQ plus individuals, but we're in a very different moment right now. And you might recognize that signature there. It evokes a little bit of trauma. So we're in a moment now where our current president is issuing a lot of executive orders, aimed at all different kinds of things. But some of the first were executive orders that were targeting trans individuals. And actually, the first executive order, which was signed on the same day he took the oath of office, the title is a long title of the executive order, but it's couched as defending women. Defending women is actually in the title. And what it actually does is deceptive in its name, and I think that was intentional. What it actually does is it sets out a plan or a set of values, and I'm using quotes, of the federal government regarding trans individuals. It attempts to erase trans individuals by not allowing them to do some very basic things in terms of, well, that and another executive order, in terms of their documentation, in terms of their choice of gender and documentation. So what does an executive order exactly mean? Who thinks it has the same force or same kind of power as a law that's passed by Congress and either signed by the president or overridden, a veto overridden by Congress? It doesn't have the same force of law, but what it does is it sets a tone and it gives direction to employees of the executive branch about what they can and cannot do, in theory, within the law. And so the executive orders that we've seen recently have certainly set a tone that has made our government much more hostile to LGBTQ individuals, to immigrants, and to others. And along with that, or in the wake of that, there have been moves to erase LGBTQ plus presence from key federal agencies, from policies and guidance. And two examples right away were what the National Park Service did with the Stonewall National Historic Site in the West Village, in Greenwich Village. They, on the website, in a very ham-handed way, very sloppy, like, what are you doing? Removed transgender, the reference to transgender from the website. But if you went deeper in, they didn't remove it in all places just because they did it very quickly in very, very sloppy way. But the intent was to remove a key piece of history from what occurred at that site, because it was transgender women who were among the first to stand up and say, enough is enough, both at Stonewall and in another earlier site, Conference Cafeteria in Los Angeles, where a very similar protest happened. So the National Park Service attempted to scrub that out. Left LGB, but removed the T. At the Department of Education, which this administration wants to eliminate, at the Department of Education, they did a similar thing. They removed all reference to transgender individuals and to any guidance or direction that was created by the Department of Education for local school districts. And in doing that, not only did they remove anything related to transgender individuals, but anything related to lesbian, gay, and bisexual students and families as well. So for those within our community who thought, oh, this is just trans individuals, it isn't, because we can look at what the Department of Education did, and it kind of sets the tone for it. We're not going to stop here. We're going to push this as far as we can. Another thing that has come under attack or is in question right now is Title IX, which is part of federal law that has been interpreted to mean that students need to be treated fairly and equally based on their expressed gender and without regard to their sexual orientation. This is what allows young people to participate in sports, which compels students to give all students equal opportunity and compels local school districts to support LGBT students. Title IX is still the law of the land, and the interpretation of the courts still stands, but this is an administration who has said, we're not going to enforce it. We're not going to do anything to make sure that law is followed, opening the door for school districts to not follow the law. Our school district here in New Paltz is making a choice to continue to follow Title IX and has actually recently voted on, the school board voted on and approved a gender support plan. So there are districts that are choosing not to, but it opens the door for young people, LGBTQI individuals, to be treated unfairly in the school setting. So there's a lack of enforcement, and we're in a situation where we're waiting for the next shoe to drop, and we're really relying on the courts right now. And if we go back and we look at how long it took, so when we say we're relying on the courts, and we go back and we look here, it took almost 3 years for this decision. So we're in an environment right now where if the federal government chooses to push things further, we are relying on the courts, which do not move quickly. So it makes us vulnerable in this moment. Another thing that I think is important that we are seeing with LGBTQ individuals, particularly trans individuals, we're seeing it occur with immigrants as well, is that we are in a moment where our federal administration, what is happening here, the narrative that has been existing, it was happening during the presidential campaign, it's been out there, but now it's in the White House. We are in a moment where we are otherizing people, where we are making people others. And the reason I have the pink triangle here, because this was a symbol that the LGBTQ plus community took back in the 1980s in the wake of the AIDS crisis, but this was also a symbol that the Nazis used to otherize LGBTQ individuals, and of course the yellow star to otherize Jewish individuals. And that was really a first step when we think about the Nazi regime. That was a first step in otherizing people, because when you otherize them, you kind of open the door to treating them differently or giving permission for that. And the Nazi regime actually, they sent people here to America to better understand how we were otherizing people. Anyone want to guess who we were otherizing at that time?
Jews.
Well, Jews to a certain extent. I heard Native Americans, African Americans, Jim Crow. So here in this country, we had laws that otherized individuals. And so the Nazis came here to understand better how we were able to do that, so they could take that information back and implement it in Germany. And so, ironically, sadly, we ended up going to war with Germany and with the Axis powers. But part of what they were doing that was so reprehensible was based on what they observed our society, our country doing. So once you effectively other a person, when you make them othered, it becomes easier and more palatable to act against them, for the government to act against them. Because what you're doing is you're setting up a dynamic where you're telling people, these people are not like you. You're safe, they're others. And it makes it more permissible to treat them differently and often negatively. So those people are not us, and what is happening to them could not happen to us. And we're seeing this happen now to LGBTQ plus individuals, I said, also to immigrants. And it's something that we need to be watching out for and we need to be mindful of. So, that's not a really happy note, but there are some things that we should remember. That our LGBTQ plus community has overcome challenges before, and I saw that happen in the 1980s, when our government refused to acknowledge that gay men and others, I mean, initially gay men, Haitian individuals, and then it spread, that individuals were dying. And they were dying, these gruesome deaths that no one understood at the time. And there was a real need for research, and there was a need for money for treatment. And our government ignored it. And it was the LGBTQ community that stood up and said, no, you have to acknowledge. And yes, it is absolutely true that people were impacted and continue to be impacted by that crisis. It's also true that that activism led our community to a better place. It created the energy that led to decisions like the decision that makes gay marriage or same-sex marriage legal. So our community has overcome challenges before, and it's important that we have to continue to celebrate and feel joy, whether that's yourself or family members. We have to give them the space to celebrate and feel joy, if for no other reason that we need strength we need to garner strength to fight what we're in for now, and likely in for at least the next few years. And I have to say that in our community, this is also real important because, particularly for transgender individuals right now, it is a moment of real kind of existential crisis. Imagine walking through your day knowing that what is coming out of the White House, what is coming out of leaders in our country is, dialogue and narrative that seeks to erase you or nullify you. So it's a reason that we do need to celebrate and feel joy.
We want to have a little time for questions.
Okay, great.
So we want to ask questions, but if you don't mind, I'll ask the first one.
Okay.
Okay. So there's a number of red states who have petitioned the courts to remove same-sex marriage. So if you can talk about that. And my other question is, trans people, thanks to executive orders now, from what I understand, their passport has to have their birth gender, and they have been removed from the military.
Mm-hmm.
And so how, if you can just, I guess, start with those two things.
Yeah, there's so much, but those are two good things. So the second executive order that spoke to trans individuals stated basically that individuals did not have the right to choose their gender on their passports. Their gender had to match the gender they were assigned at birth, so the gender on their birth certificate. This is problematic in a number of different ways. First of all, it has been the policy of our government for several years to allow choice. For individuals who are transgender, they may not appear at all like the gender that they were assigned at birth. So imagine you're just taking a simple trip up to Montreal, not going far, and you have to present your passport at the border crossing, and you appear to the world as a woman, but you were assigned male at birth. Your birth certificate now has to have an MI. And that is problematic in and of itself, but then your other documentation may not match your passport. Because here in New York State and in California and other states, individuals have a right to have an M, an F, or an X for gender on their driver's license. So it just sets up a situation where trans individuals can be harassed or interrogated, or makes them fearful. There is one of the team who works with me at the community center, her husband is a transgender individual who appears to the world. You would meet him and you would think, this is a man, because that's how he appears to the world, but he was assigned female at birth. And so his birth certificate says F on it. his passport says M. They are choosing this summer not to travel outside the country. They had a planned trip. They were going to go to Italy because the staff person who works with me, that's where her family's originally from. They're not doing it this year. That's, in the scheme of all things, they have a nice home, they have good jobs, all of that. But it still is something that is being curtailed by this administration. And what we've done at the community center is we have hosted 2 workshops to give guidance to people. And we did this before the inauguration and right afterwards because we could see this coming. And working with the Chosen Family Law Center, we provided guidance to individuals about how best to handle the situation. And for trans individuals right now who need a passport renewal, may not be the best time. If you can wait a little bit and see what happens, may not be the best time. I know someone here in New Paltz who was transgender, has been for many years, transitioned many years ago, sent in their passport because, as those of you who have done it know, you have to relinquish, you have to send in your current passport to get your new passport when you renew. They have never gotten back their original passport and they have not gotten a newly issued one, and it's been several months. So that issue in and of itself, while it may seem small, is having an impact on individuals. And then in terms of the military, our military and the former Fox News host who leads the military has taken steps to remove transgender individuals from the military. These are individuals who have served our country well. There has never been an issue, but they are simply transgender. They are of a gender that does not match the one they were assigned at birth, and that's the only reason that's occurring. That's occurring at the same time that this individual is removing Black individuals, African American individuals from positions of leadership, and is removing women from places of leadership. So one of the challenges we have, or one of the opportunities we have, is to work in coalition with other activist groups, because it's not just happening to LGBTQ+ individuals, it's happening to others who are being othered or marginalized by this administration.
And what about the red states with same-sex marriage?
Yes, thank you. There was a lot there. That one. This is part of a decided strategy to bring a case to the Supreme Court. So if you have a state that passes a law which is in violation of federal law as decided by the courts, then you have an opportunity to bring that to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court doesn't have to hear it. They could choose not to hear it, but it's an opportunity to bring it to the Supreme Court. And knowing that Clarence Thomas gave the invitation for the Supreme Court to hear this case and potentially reverse that. Now, what would that mean for those of us like me who are legally married to a person of the same gender? It would likely mean that our marriages would stand, but no future marriages could be performed. Other individuals would not have the right to illegal inheritance. And this has a profound impact on people. There are people throughout our history, in the AIDS crisis, people who lost everything because their partner died and they had no legal right to their shared estate. Or they were living in an apartment that was only in a condominium or an apartment or a house that was only in their partner's name, their late partner's name. That late partner's family, their next of kin, had rights to the estate. So people who lost everything. I lost everything many years ago in that very situation. Family member who took advantage of my husband and then became my late husband, took advantage of them, and I lost a lot as a result of that. So it's real, and we don't want to see it happen again.
Any other questions in the last few minutes that we have?
I
Okay.
just wanted to know how, when they arrested people, they came in their homes. When they arrested people and came in their homes, how did they know they were having sex or that they were different?
During the sodomy laws.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't know, like the Bowers versus Hardwick case, I don't know how they knew. In all likelihood, it was a call from a neighbor or something, because it was an apartment complex. So those of you who live in apartments know that like your neighbors can get a little rowdy sometimes. And I don't know if that was it, but it was a report made to the police who came in, busted into the apartment, no warrant, busted into the apartment based on information they had that an illegal act of sodomy was occurring.
Any other questions?
And I should say that we see the same tactic happening now with ICE. They're busting into people's houses. They're busting into people's apartments. No warrant, simply based on the assumption that the person there is undocumented or persons there are undocumented. So we're seeing the same thing happen.
We have a retired librarian here, so I'll ask on behalf of her. I read that, again, based on executive order, the military has removed all LGBT-themed books from military libraries. And yeah, so I wonder if you, and from all the websites, the federal government websites as well.
I did not know that, although I'm not surprised at that. So there are libraries on military bases. Yeah, so under the direction from the former Fox News host who apparently thinks it's okay to use Signal for, communication that should be protected. This is happening. I'm so not surprised that it is. It's unfortunate because people feel empowered to do this. We had our press secretary say that the reason for firing the librarian, the head librarian of the Library of Congress, an African-American woman, so woman and African-American, don't think that doesn't matter, was because she was placing inappropriate books in the Library of Congress. What the moron at the mic did not realize is that that's the Library of Congress's charge. 2 copies of every book published under federal law are sent to the Library of Congress. She was doing her job.
So I guess my last question, I don't know if you can have your crystal ball, but you probably get asked this. What do you think will be the future? None of us can know for sure. But looking at things, where do you think we're going to be? I mean, the U.S. is on many countries' lists of do not go there because it is not safe. Mm-hmm. So many European countries, people are being warned not to come there because it's not safe. So what do you think, where do you think we're going to be in 3 years?
Well, I think the best case scenario is that in about 1.5 years now, we see that at least one of the houses of Congress flips. I think that's the best case scenario, and that will slow some of this down. Is it going to stop kind of the dangerous, unthought out, kind of diabolical things that the executive branch is doing? It may not, but what it will stop Congress simply burying its head or just going along. I think that's the best case scenario that we've got. I will say this, however, I am with the alternative, so I think that's the best case scenario. And we have to try to minimize impact and damage until then. And we have to be active and we have to be engaged to make that happen. I will say this though, I serve on the board of the Child Welfare League of America. One of 2 LGBTQ individuals who do. And one of actually the president of our board right now, none of you know, I hope, because I'm going to tell you something he told me at the board meeting, but he's from the state of Virginia. State of Virginia has this unique wrinkle in that governors cannot run for re-election. So this board member, who is the head of social services for the state of Virginia, has worked for both Democratic and Republican governors because they also tend to vacillate from one term to the next. And he's become rather good at doing that. He recently had the opportunity to go to the Republican Governors Conference. This was after the election, but soon after the election. And what he said to us at a recent board meeting for the Child Welfare League is he said, you have to understand that they are not looking at this as 4 years. They are looking at this as 12 years. So 12 years. Trump serves 4, and then J.D. Vance follows him. And J.D. Vance was just made the head of the Finance Committee for the Republican National Committee, which gives him an extraordinary amount of power over how the Republican National Committee distributes money. And that could be very important in the next presidential election. So we have to remain active.
As is all the voter suppression, because then, of course, you can change who's in power if you don't like them, if you can't vote.
Mm-hmm.
So, any other questions before we, yes, Peter, come.
I want to start out by thanking you for an excellent presentation.
Thank you.
I thought it was really good. I would make a couple of suggestions that things that I saw omitted. One would be at least a very brief mention of how things are in other countries. So countries that are better, that are more advanced, more progressive, and then countries that are much worse than we are. And then when you talked about the 20s, what I missed was you mentioned the advancement of gays and lesbians and African Americans, but what you didn't mention was a huge advancement for women in general, right? 51%.
Yeah.
Women who got the vote in 1920,
Good point.
women who went into factories and offices during World War I. You mentioned it in World War II, but the same phenomenon occurred during World War I. So I think that was the greatest advancement for women ever in recorded history during the 1920s. Getting the vote,
Good point.
getting agency for themselves. And then lastly, and I might have missed it, but I don't know if you made reference at all to the issue of trans women in sports, and that's become a huge issue at the moment.
Yeah, and I knew I only had a limited amount of time because we could talk about that. You know, the number of professional trans athletes in this country, you know, we would need everyone's hands in this room to count them out. It is a very, very small group of individuals. The number of collegiate athletes who are trans, less than 1% of all collegiate athletes. This is a very small population that this administration and those who are aligned with them have taken and used. So, I know it's a difficult issue, and there's differing feeling about it, but the fact of the matter is, this is such a small issue within the context of everything we're dealing with. It should not have been made into the huge issue that it is.
Yeah, I given Richard an hour. He can't talk about everything. There's also the Obama administration and military. When the ban was finally over, we had so many decorated LGBT service people being thrown out, and then that ban ended under Obama. But you can't talk about everything in an hour.
Yeah. And that's something that had real impact as well. My godfather served in the Air Force. He was gay, and he was kicked out.
So they stopped the ban.
And you know, President Obama, you know, we have feelings about. I think he was an extraordinary president. And I remember the night he was elected, and I said to my husband, "This is incredible, and there will be blowback." Because I knew for too many people in this country, a black family living in the White House was too far, too much. And this is what we're in the blowback now. It's all related. But also I want to say of President Obama, he didn't change his mind solely because he came to a greater understanding about gays in the military or about same-sex marriage. He understood where public tone was at the time and what people were speaking about and what activists were saying. It's important that we're active and we're vocal. And we can all do that in different ways. We can't all do the same thing, but to the extent that we can, we have to. You know, one thing here that we can do is New York, we, you know, here, right here in New Paltz, we're represented by someone who is with us on the issues in Congress, Pat Ryan. But just south of here, Mike Lawler votes consistently with the Trump administration. He is a Republican. You know, he has made lip service to supporting our community, to supporting others, to speaking out about what's happening to immigrants, but he's not doing it. It's an opportunity for any of us who know someone who lives in his district to get them active, to educate them. And we recently had Michelle Hinchy, our state senator, speak at the community center. And something she said is that we should all be calling Elise Stefanik's office, we should all be calling Mike Lawler's office, because the two of them want to run for governor, and even if we don't live in their district, they need to know they're going to be counting on our vote, and we're pissed off about what they're doing or not doing.
If anyone's interested in the LGBTQ Community Center of the Hudson Valley, they have a website, and I'm sure Richard on the way out can answer questions. They have many, many programs, including things like this, and a lot of groups for various different groups.
We do. I'll just mention a couple of them. We have our Rainbow Lounge, which is Thursdays from, let's get the time wrong, 3 to 4:30. And that is a group for individuals 50 plus. The demographic skews a little bit older than 50.
I'm too young for that group.
Exactly, Joe. Next year, you know?
Next year, okay.
That's one. And we've recently started another group on Sundays, which is a fiber arts drop-in. And it's just a wonderful mix of people of all different ages and generations who are just knitting or some are working on textile design and others are crocheting, some are doing embroidery. It's just people who want to hang out together and are involved in fiber arts. We also have a great committee that is working on our library, which is led by John Giralico. Some of you, if you've lived in New Paltz for a while, know he was for 47 years the director of our library here in New Paltz. He's retired, and so now he's leading a group that are working on our library at the community center. So we have lots of great people. And one of the ways that we're able to be open 6 days a week is because we have wonderful volunteers who staff our front desk. And that's something that we're really appreciative of. And it's just nice for people to come in and see a welcoming face.
All right, well, thank you very much, Richard. I appreciate your time.